is really perfect for this task. She is an accomplished scientist, and we thought, particularly in this age where science has come under question as a viable discourse, that it was very important to have somebody who can speak with that voice and that authority of science. And she studies climate change and why it matters to us here and now. Her PBS digital series, if you haven't seen it, Global Weirding, it's not only interesting and informative, it's fun. So, and it's good for our kids, and it's good for a broad range of different demographic and audiences. One of the things that Katharine, in speaking with her, having dinner with her last night, that she spoke to immediately was the direction her career went. And she attributes having moved to Texas for that happening. I don't know how many things we can attribute to Texas for changing our careers or our lives, but it did hers. And it really directed her life to becoming more of what I would say is a public intellectual, of taking what could be a very niche kind of study and research, which she would do with that clandestine bunch of people who speak the special language of climate change, and they only know what they're talking about, and so forth. And she's decided to become a translator of that science and of the importance of those issues to a broader public. And she's done that very effectively through the years. She's been recognized by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world, by Foreign Policy as one of the 100 global thinkers, by Politico as one of the thinkers, doers, and visionaries transforming American politics, and most recently by Fortune as one of the world's greatest leaders. I don't know what else you need to say about somebody beyond that. She also teaches political science and directs the Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University, which is located not in Austin, not in Fort Worth, but in Lubbock, Texas. I only know Lubbock, Texas because Waylon Jennings and Buddy Holly are from there. Buddy Holly's probably ages me out a little bit here with most of you. Waylon Jennings genres me out. She currently serves as the lead author for the U.S. Global Change Research Program's Climate Science Special Report and the 4th U.S. National Climate Assessment. She's published very widely. She speaks all over the world and is part of a lot of very interesting groups that are doing their own form of collective action. What is very interesting about her research and what makes it relevant is that her research focuses on the local and regional impacts of climate change. And again, unless we can make that case to our fellow citizens, we don't make a case at all. Because we don't feel climate change, we here in Cincinnati don't necessarily feel climate change on a day-to-day basis. Trying to convince people that this is a crisis and something we should deal with is really one of the challenges. I can think of no one better to help us think about these issues today than Katharine Hayhoe. Help me welcome her to Xavier and the Midwest Regional Sustainability Center.
There we go. It is such a pleasure to be with you here today. Now, let me just remind you, I am going to be using this. And if you cannot see this easily, you do want to move. You have a couple of minutes because I'm not going to use them yet. But I do recommend if you're over here and you don't feel like you can see the screen, there's a lot of empty tables right there. When I first moved to Texas, about 12 years ago now, I didn't know what to expect. I had figured out by then that there were a large number of people who didn't think that climate change was real and who thought what I did studying climate science was about 2 rungs lower down the ladder of credibility from astrology. I had also figured out that a lot of those people lived in Texas. So when my husband was being headhunted by Texas Tech University and they said that they would actually make a spousal accommodation for me too, we had previously been living in South Bend, Indiana, where he was at Notre Dame and I was working at University of Chicago, and those are about 2 hours apart from each other. I figured, I don't know what's going to happen. What is it going to be like moving to a big university where I'm the first climate scientist at the university, and where many of the people around me, including in my own department, are not on board with the idea that climate is changing and humans are responsible? Within 2 months of moving there, I got my first invitation to speak to a women's group. It was the League of Women Voters in West Texas. So it was kind of, middle of the road. And there weren't a lot of people there who were really, totally on board with the idea that climate was changing, but they were very curious and they had a lot of questions. So me, the scientist, I showed up and I started with science and I talked about science and I ended with science. And then I got a lot of questions. Well, how do you know? How do you know it isn't the sun? How do you know it isn't natural cycles? I said, well, those are good questions. Let me go get you some answers. So one of the women there was from the local university club, and so she invited me to speak there, and so I changed my presentation. I answered those questions. And then I got a bunch of questions saying, well, but why does it matter? I mean, we live here in West Texas. Lubbock, where I live, actually won the Weather Channel's Craziest Weather in the Country award. And I said, well, but why does climate change matter? So I said, well, that's a good question. So when another woman at that event, you see there's a trail of women here connecting this whole thing, another woman at that event went to Second Baptist Church. Not first, second. Second can try things out that first isn't quite sure about yet. She invited me to speak to Second Baptist, so I changed my presentation. I made sure I talked about impacts, why it matters to Texas. And from there, it just kind of snowballed. Before I knew it, I was talking to the Senior Citizens Club, I was talking to the Kiwanis Club, I was talking to the local Rotary Club, I was talking to water managers and city planners. And it got to the point where the only questions left were, what can I do about it? And that is the toughest question for a scientist because we are really good at diagnosing the problem. We are like the oncologist or the radiologist. We're the ones who look at the scans and say, oh, that's the problem. And then you say to the scientist, well, so what am I supposed to do with it? And we're like, well, that's not what we do. But I realized that if I was going to be speaking to people about this massive challenge that we had, I had to have some answers. And so today, when I talk to people, most frequently when I'm talking to farmers, ranchers, land managers, water planners, today I spend the majority of my time talking about the solutions. Because people don't realize that there are viable, practical, attractive, beneficial solutions. But I don't have to talk about that here because you all know that. This is what you do. I absolutely loved hearing the brief talks that came before because they were all positive and they were about solutions and they made me feel inspired and hopeful, yes? Yes. I know it's a bit early. There is still coffee over there. Why do we need that hope so badly? Because that is what keeps us going. That's what moves us forward. Over the last year, the number one question I have gotten is, what gives you hope? And my answer is, it is not the science. The science does not give me hope because every time we look at this planet of ours, it seems like things are changing faster to a greater extent than we thought. The rate of sea level rise has doubled in the last 25 years. Antarctica is melting 3 times faster now than it was 10 years ago. Heat waves, droughts, wildfires, hurricanes. 40% of the rainfall that fell during Harvey would not have fallen 100 years ago during that same hurricane. We're seeing these changes happening, and that is not what gives me hope. What gives me hope is hearing the stories that every single one of you have to share. So the rest of this event is about those stories. It is about what is already happening. It is about what is happening right now, and it is what you want to happen in the future. I want to live in a sustainable neighborhood. I want to go paddling with you down the river in August. These are the types of things that make us feel like change is possible. But at the same time, we can't ignore why we need the change. And that is what I do, and that is what I know. Why do we need change? Why are we talking about resilience? Why are we at such an urgent point in the history of civilization, really? It's not an exaggeration to say that, where we have to consider carefully how and why we are doing the things that we do and how we can change them to become more resilient. So my story to you today begins almost a year ago. I was at the lake with my family, and I made the critical mistake of picking up the phone when it rang at 6:45 a.m. Has anybody ever done that? Have you ever picked up the phone when you were asleep and you really wish you hadn't done it? I usually turn the ringer off for that very reason. I made the critical mistake of picking up the phone while I was asleep, and it was the BBC saying, "Could you be live on the air in 3 minutes?" And because I was asleep, I said yes, because my instinct is always to say yes. It's a terrible instinct. So before I knew it, before I had a chance to change out of pajamas or get tea or anything like that, there I was live on the air with the BBC, and the first question out of their mouth was it you who leaked the report? And I said, "What are you talking about? I have no idea." They clarified they were talking about this report, which has since been released last November. They said, "Well, you're a lead author on the Climate Science Special Report for the US federal government, and it was just leaked to the New York Times this morning. Are you the one who did it?" I said, "Well, the public review copy has been available for anybody who wanted to read it for 6 months now, and apparently nobody did, except maybe the New York Times." Why was there so much interest in this report? There was so much interest because it still is, the most comprehensive and up-to-date assessment of the state of climate science today, and it was being released by who? By the current administration. Why? Because it was already in the pipeline before. It is mandated under the Global Change Research Act. If the government does not produce one of these reports every 4 years, they actually can be sued, and the Bush administration was threatened with that. It's very long. There's a lot of different authors. It was reviewed by 12 different federal agencies, and public review, expert review, peer review, and even a review by the National Academy of Sciences that was 131 pages long. And we had to respond to every line. Next time you get a review that you think is difficult, just remember this and realize I am over here playing a very tiny violin for you. The report talked about hurricanes. It talked about changes in extreme temperatures, how especially our nights and our winters are getting warmer. It talked about changes in wildfire activity, how the area burned by wildfires is increasing. It talked about increases in heavy precipitation, which we're seeing particularly across the Northeast and the Midwest. It talked about esoteric features like atmospheric rivers that are hitting the West Coast, dumping huge amounts of rain. But at the same time, this most recent up-to-date comprehensive report can be summarized in just one sentence. And that sentence is, it's real, it's us, it's serious, and the window of time to prevent widespread dangerous impacts is closing fast. Why was the BBC, and subsequently it seemed like every single news outlet in the world, why were they so fascinated by the fact that this report was coming out? I've never done so many interviews in my pajama bottoms in my life. It was 3 o'clock before I actually took them off, but I managed to put a decent top on because a lot of people wanted to do Skype. Why was I getting calls from every single news outlet, from Fox News to CNN to BBC to CBC in Canada, to talk about this report? It's because we're convinced that the biggest problem we have is that people reject the science. That's what we're convinced about. And so people are like, this is gonna show them. This is it. This is the final nail in the coffin. But if we look at the social science, and I've learned so much from the science of how people interact with information, if we look at the social science, there's this really great set of polls by the Yale program on climate communication. A few of you are nodding. You've probably seen these before. If you haven't, I encourage you to look them up. Just Google Yale climate opinion. They'll pop right up. You can get results by county and by congressional district. So you can look for the Cincinnati area specifically. And they ask people questions. So if any area is orange, it means it's greater than 50%, and the darker the color, the higher it is. Of course, if it's blue, it's less than 50%. So they asked people, and this was 2 years ago, and the numbers have actually gone up since then. They asked people, do you think global warming is happening? Well, you know what? Most of the country is orange. In fact, where I live, in the most conservative part of the country, 70% of people think that it's happening. Then they asked people, do you think global warming will harm plants and animals? Ironically, I don't know if you can see, it's not exactly the same map. If you look at Utah, you can see a bit of a changes. So ironically, even more people think it will harm plants and animals than think it's happening. This is our first clue that logic is not part of this. Then they asked, do you think global warming will harm future generations? Yes. Okay, so we've got it's real, it's going to harm plants and animals, it's going to harm future generations, and yes, it will harm people in developing countries. But now the rubber starts to hit the road. Do you think global warming is already harming people in the US now or within the next 10 years? And that's not the worst one. They then said, do you think global warming will, not is, but will, do you think it will ever harm you? Now all you are sorry you didn't move. Hopefully you can still see that. It's very dark blue. So will a 500-page report with all of its footnotes and references and carefully designed graphics and tweetable links, will it be sufficient to fix the problem that we have today? No. Because the problem isn't being convinced that the science is real. The problem is we don't think it matters. And why do we not think it matters? I'm actually going to ask you the question because I bet you know. Here's how I'm going to ask you. Take out your phone. Yeah, for real. Do take out your phone. And I'm going to ask you to text. Now, Texas Tech is my institution. Don't take any personal offense. I know we did pretty good at basketball this year. But this is just the name they gave me when I signed in. So text Texas Tech, all one word, no spaces. Doesn't have to be caps. It can be lowercase or caps. To 37607, and you will get a response saying, thank you for joining Katharine Hayhoe's poll. Did you get the response? Anybody?
Give the number again.
The number is 37607, and you have to type Texas Tech, all one word. Has it worked for anybody yet? Oh, we have a hand there. Oh, we have a ton of hands. Okay. All right. So again, just type Texas Tech to 37607. All right, can everybody put up your hand if you've gotten the response now? Okay, awesome, we are great. I have a 400-person limit, so I think we're gonna be good on this. Okay, now here's my question to you, ready? And what I want you to do is I want you to reply by text. Don't leave any spaces in what you type this time, no spaces. Why is it, remember the question is, why is it that people don't think global warming will harm them personally? Because if you ask somebody to design the cover of a book or a movie poster about global warming, what is the #1 image or picture they will put on the cover of that book or movie poster? Go. #1 image that the most people in the world would pick when you say global warming? Oop. There we go. Is this working? Oh, shoot. I could see it on my computer. Why can't... It's thinking about it. I can actually see it here. Why is it not working? Just a second here. It must be something funky with the internet. Internet's here. Let's try this. Let's try this. No. Oh, see, those are all your answers. Isn't that awesome? All right. People got it. Yes, up until last August, the #1 image was polar bear. Now, hurricane is starting to take over a little bit because of the crazy season that we had last year. But for most people, the #1 image is a polar bear. Isn't this cool? Yeah. This is all your answers. The #1 image is a polar bear, usually sitting on a piece of ice looking sad. Now, I'm going to poll you the old-fashioned way now. We have a pretty big room full of people. A lot of you have probably traveled widely. You're citizens of the world. How many people in this large room have ever seen a polar bear in real life with their eyes in the wild? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Put up my hand too, 5. Only 5 of us have ever seen the #1 symbol of a changing climate in real life. And if that is what we associate with the changing climate, and most people do, then why would we care? If you've ever been up to northern Canada, you know there's not a lot there. You could raise seals, you could feed them to the polar bears, you could give them as much land as they want. There are ways to take care of the polar bears that do not involve changing the entire energy system of the whole world. Now, for some people, we are conscious enough of the fact that climate change is affecting people, but the people we picture are not people in the places where we live. They're people who live far away. Today, it might be Houston, but it might be people in the Caribbean, people in Puerto Rico, people in South Sea Islands, people who live far away from us. And so the most dangerous myth, in my opinion, that we've bought into is not the myth that the science isn't real. It's the myth that climate change is a distant issue, that it only affects people who are far away in space or in time. Future generations are people who live far away. That is the dangerous myth. But the reality is this: we care about a changing climate because of us. After the polar bear, we are one of the most vulnerable species to a changing climate. Why is that? Well, if you look back in human history, this is the last human population in millions of people in the last 2,000 years. We haven't been around very long. In fact, I looked up a couple of interesting dates. We've only had agriculture, which of course we depend on today to feed us all, right? I mean, how many people live off hunting and grazing now, right? Agriculture, we've had for about 12,000 years. The oldest currently inhabited city, which is interestingly Damascus, was founded, as far as they can tell, around 9,000 BC. The first complex city-state, not exactly country, but city-state, we're talking 6,000 years ago, and the first known form of writing was only 5,000 years ago. We haven't been around very long. And so the climate conditions that we are used to are not what the Earth has ever experienced in the past. And so in that report that I shared with you, in this report right here, which you can read in its entirety in final form online, no leaking necessary. In this report, even though most of it, as I said, could be summarized by this single sentence, there was one little chapter at the end that not a lot of people got to. And that chapter at the end was called The Potential for Surprise. And when we say surprise, as a climate scientist, we're not talking about happy surprise. We're not talking about birthday parties or unexpected windfalls, like when I discovered I had been overpaying my gas bill and they owed me $2,000. True, sad story, but happy surprise. I think it actually made the ladies' day more than me. She was like, "You're not going to believe this. You're not going to believe this." It was like almost like that Saturday Night Live skit, where she's like, "I have to tell you. I just have to tell you." That's not, unfortunately, the type of surprise we're talking about. When you look at the history of this planet, we know that carbon dioxide levels have now passed 410 parts per million, and this is a record of carbon dioxide in the past from ice cores, a level that last occurred when? A long time before human civilization. And why does that matter to us? Because when the Earth has a chance to adapt to what we've put in the atmosphere, we're going to see a lot higher temperature and sea level. And when I say a lot, I mean meters, not feet. It's going to take a while for that to happen. It won't happen in our lifetime, but it's something that we have put in motion today. Not only that, but if we continue to produce more and more carbon dioxide, we're going to lead to levels we haven't seen in tens of millions of years. Why do we care about a changing climate? We care about it because we are perfectly adapted to the last 10,000 years. That's why we care. 2/3 of our biggest cities are built within a few feet of sea level. And sea level will rise more than a few feet this century. As long as there's been humans on this planet, this is not a real Egyptian diagram, it is fake, but it makes the point. As long as there's been humans on this planet, we have been vulnerable to risks, right? But we care about a changing climate because it takes those risks and it exacerbates the risks. And I'm going to talk more about that in detail. But get out your phones again. Here you go. Let's see, is this one actually working? Yeah, this one's actually working. I want to poll you first, though. I want to ask you, and be honest, because I cannot track your answers. Nobody knows who you are and what you answered. On your priority list, where would you put climate change? Top 5, top 10, top 100, or I couldn't care less? And honestly, if you say I couldn't care less, you're in the right place because you're going to learn more. All right. So we have, oh, top 10's increasing. Going up. So we have top 5 in the first place, followed closely by top 10. Now, I'm going to share my answer with you. My answer is now you might say, okay, you're a climate scientist. How does that work? Climate change is not on my priority list. Why? Because the only reason I care about a changing climate is because it affects everything else already on my priority list. And this is really critical because where does this depressing figure come from? The map that is all blue that says we don't think global warming will harm us personally. If you're wondering what those small orange areas are down in the south, those orange areas are counties that are predominantly Hispanic Catholic because Hispanic Catholics are the most concerned people group in the US about a changing climate. Isn't that interesting? The issue we have here is that we think we should be moving climate change higher up people's priority lists. Have you ever tried to change somebody's priority list? It is really hard. You can hardly even change a 5-year-old's priority list, let alone a 50-year-old's. Changing people's priority lists is so hard, it is almost impossible. But I have some good news for you. We don't have to change people's priority lists because the only reason we care about a changing climate is because it affects the things that we already care about today. What do we already care about today? We care about the health and safety and welfare of our families, of our communities, of our cities. We want equity and justice. We want a healthy economy with jobs. We want safe places to live and good food to eat and great things to do and a higher quality of life. We want independence and freedom and the ability to make choices and the freedom to do so. We want all of these things already, and why do we care about climate change? We care about climate change precisely because it affects these things. And once we realize it's not a case of reworking people's priority lists, it's a case of connecting the dots between what is already on their priority list and climate change, all of a sudden our job just got a lot easier. Because what's the first step in that process? The first step is to figure out what their priorities are. How do you do that? Ask. Ask questions, have a conversation. Look at the pictures of their kids. Talk about what they did on the weekend. Ask them about their fears and their concerns, their anxieties, their loves, their passions, their enthusiasms. Figure out what makes people tick, and then draw the dots, connect the line between that and a changing climate. I am passionate about my child, and I'm sure you are too. I care deeply about his future, and that's why I'm concerned about the impact a changing climate has on not just our planet in general, but what's happening right here in the place where I live, because I want my child to have the best possible future. I care about a healthy economy. Did you know that there are many more times more jobs in the solar energy industry now than the coal industry? How can we bring more of those jobs to Cincinnati to give people employment here locally? Did you know that China actually has more wind and solar energy than any other country in the world? They are beating the pants off us. Doesn't that concern you? It concerns me too. We can make these connections with all kinds of unlikely people because we're not trying to rearrange their priority list. What we are trying to do is connect the dots. I absolutely loved hearing from Fifth Third Bank because I was a Fifth Third Bank customer when I lived in Indiana. Now I'm down in Texas where there's a lot of really small banks all over the state, and one of our regional bank owners actually lived next door to us. He was never really on board with the whole idea that climate was changing, and one day I got invited to speak to the Rotary Club that he attends. A lot of West Texas business people giving me the eye, wondering, why did she get invited, and what is she going to talk about? So I'm not a Rotarian. Many of you probably are. I'm not a Rotarian, but when I walked in, I saw this big, giant blue banner with yellow writing on it that said the four-way test. The four-way test is what guides Rotarians in their decisions. Is it fair? No, sorry, the first one is it the truth? Is it fair? Would it be beneficial to all concerned? And I looked at this list and I thought to myself, this is climate change. Is it the truth? Yes. Is it fair? Heck no. That's why I care. Would it be beneficial to address it? Yes, it would. And so I took my presentation and I rearranged it around the four-way test because that was their values. And rather than trying to convince them that the impacts were serious to Texas, I was just putting it in their frame of values, connecting the dots between the four-way test and climate change. And I will never forget, at the end of my talk, that man, that banker, came up to me with the most bemused look on his face I've ever seen. And he said, you know, I never really thought this thing was real. And I was like, I think that was clear. And he said, no, I didn't really say that. That was my internal monologue. But he said, but it passed the four-way test. What can I do? What had I done? Had I changed his values at all? I had not changed his values one tiny bit. What I had done was I had simply connected the issue with his values. Now, it isn't usually that easy. You don't normally get this giant, life-size poster with somebody's values written out on it in bulleted form. But we can put it together. We're good at relationships. We're good at talking with people. That's most of what most of us do in our lives. We can put these things together. Figure out what are people's top priorities and then connect the dots, because that's why we care. So how does climate change affect us? What I'm going to do now is I want to give you some ideas, some things that you can connect the dots on, okay? First of all, though, I want to highlight the fact that we're used to coping with something like this all the time, right? We're used to coping with heat and cold and flood and drought. And what are our brains built to remember? Our human brains are built to remember the extremes. Our human brains are not built to add up temperature, precipitation, humidity, and wind speed on every single day of the year for at least 20 to 30 years, and then fit a trend line through it in our heads to determine whether climate is changing. Our brains are not built to do that. Our brains are built to remember weather. And so let me ask you, this is a great discussion I always have with my students. Let me ask you, here in Cincinnati, now this doesn't have to be in Cincinnati, this is in your whole life, what crazy weather event do you remember best? Think back over your life. Rain and flood, heat wave, hurricane, tornado, hail, or windstorm, blizzard, or have you had a completely uneventful life, in which case you should come visit me in Texas for 2 days. And I guarantee you will have at least 2 of these in 2 days. All right, it looks like we have a rain and flood and blizzards leading the way with some tornadoes and hail and windstorm following up too. I used to live in South Bend, as I mentioned before, and when we lived in South Bend, people say, oh, you're from Canada, everything's fine. I was like, no, we do not get this stuff in Canada. Straight line windstorms, ice storms that knocked out the power for 2 weeks, basement floods. Oh my gosh, we lived in that old area where if it started raining, you had to drop everything and run home and go down the basement and open up this hole in the floor and crank shut this valve from 1908 to make sure your basement didn't flood from raw sewage. And one summer we had a graduate student house sitting while we were up in Canada, and he didn't take it seriously. He was like, oh, it's just a sprinkle. 4 feet of raw sewage. Yes. I was talking to somebody from South Bend the other day. He's like, yeah, I know all about that. So actually, that really sticks in my mind, the event I was not there for but had to clean up afterwards. We remember these crazy events, and they are nothing new. You know what this is? This is the 1936 heat wave. 1936. It shriveled crops in the field. Yes, this is one of those old pictures. Not one of those ones where people dress up to look old. It's old. crazy cold winters, flood and drought. There is nothing new about the crazy extremes that we experience in our lives. If you look around the whole country, though, we see that we get a lot of these, and actually Texas is number one simply because of its geographic location. It gets almost everything. The only thing that Texas does not get that I know of is glacial lake outburst floods. Other than that, yes, it gets blizzards. You might not know this, but they do. We do. We get blizzards, we get snowstorms, we get hail, and then we get everything else. We know that this is part of life, and we know that the risks that we face today, you may have seen this before, the risks we face are a function of three different things. They are a function of exposure, so how many people and how much infrastructure and how many things of value are exposed. They're a function of vulnerability, how prepared or resilient are the people and the structures and the systems. And then it's also affected by the weather and climate events themselves. So today, in terms of exposure, we already saw, where were we back here? We already saw in terms of exposure, our population is increasing. So if population is increasing, what happens to exposure? It goes up, right? More people. We're also building more and more stuff, more and more expensive stuff. So what happens to that exposure? It goes up too. What's happening to our vulnerability? In general, nothing good. This is a report that came out in February this year from the American Society of Civil Engineers, estimating that we need to spend $4.5 trillion by 2025 just to fix the roads, bridges, dams, and infrastructure that are owned at the federal level. They ranked things. They gave aviation infrastructure a D, bridges a C, dams a D. That could be dangerous. Drinking water a D. Hazardous waste a D+. They gave rail a B. I'm not sure how that happened. And ports a C+. So why do we have to increase resilience? We have to increase resilience because things are already not looking good, and that has nothing to do with climate change. That has to do with the simple fact we have more people, more infrastructure, and it's getting old, right? But then, if you picture a camel with a lot of bales of hay on that camel, then what do we have? We have somebody coming along and adding one more extra heavy bale of hay to the top of that camel's back, and that extra bale of hay is what's happening over here to the weather and the climate events. We care about a changing climate because even though we're already exposed to weather and climate events all the time, climate is changing those. It's like we always have a chance of rolling a double six. The double six is that crazy flood event or that crazy heat wave or the crazy hurricane. When we're not looking, climate change is sneaking in and replacing another one of those numbers with a 6. So all of a sudden, the risk of rolling a 6 has gone up. We care about a changing climate because it exacerbates the risks we face today. What type of risks are we talking about? Well, we do know that, oops, that shouldn't be there. That should be Cincinnati, I'm sorry. I had Cincinnati in there somewhere. We know that temperature is going up. We know that it has impacts on our air quality, on our asthma and health impacts. We know the growing season's gotten longer, and that's not necessarily a bad thing if we can take advantage of it, but with warmer weather, we're seeing increased risk of pests moving northward because the cold weather isn't keeping them at bay. We're seeing increases in the pollen season. We have kudzu, which used to be known as the vine that ate the South, all the way through the Midwest and even up into southern Ontario. Yes, kudzu is in southern Ontario now because we had enough winters in sequence that were not cold enough to kill off the roots, and so they established. We see these changes happening. What type of extremes do we care about? We care about the fact that heavy rainfall is getting more frequent and more intense because warmer air holds more water. So along comes a storm, there's more water for it to sweep up and dump on us. The biggest increases are in the Northeast, and the Midwest has seen the second biggest increases. Why do we care about heavy precipitation? Because it increased the risks of floods, of water contamination, of combined sewer overflows, and it also increased the risks of being sued by insurance companies. You might have heard of this a few years ago. Farmers Insurance sued the city of Chicago and Cook County for failing to adequately prepare for the impacts of a changing climate and leaving them to pick up the bill. It was particularly ironic because we had actually done a study for the city of Chicago a couple of years before, so they couldn't say they didn't know. But Farmers Insurance withdrew the suit, saying that they were just trying to make a point. And within 2 years, the city of Chicago had built 2 new reservoirs to collect stormwater, as well as continuing on the other actions that they were doing at that time. We're also seeing that heat waves are getting more frequent and cold waves are getting less frequent. Do we still set cold temperature records? Yeah, we do. But we're setting them less and less frequently. It used to be that it was 50-50. We set as many high temperature records as low. But now it's gotten to, 1.1 to 1, 1.4 to 1, 2 to 1. So far this decade, I think we're at 3 to 1. We're seeing a lot more high temperature extremes. We're seeing droughts are getting stronger, and in the western U.S., forest fires are burning greater and greater area. We're seeing these types of changes happening, and they're having a huge impact on us. This is the cost, the adjusted cost of billion-dollar disasters. Why is it going up? It's going up, again, for 3 reasons. It's going up because our exposure is increasing. It's going up because our vulnerability is increasing. And yes, it is also going up because many of our climate and weather risks are also increasing. It isn't one or the other or the other. It is all 3 together. And that is why it is so important when we know that our exposure and our weather and climate risks are going up. That is why it is so important to build resilience and to decrease our vulnerability. So let me ask you now. You know your city. You know your region. Tell me, what risk are you most concerned about for Cincinnati, which I misspelled with a double T, forgive me. Okay, I'm forgiven. Flood and floods, okay. I have to go over here to see them. This is really interesting because we're seeing the physical hazard emerging, but we're also seeing concern over people's responses, right? Yes. But I hope you're thinking too about what I just mentioned. Why are people apathetic? Because we haven't connected it to their priorities. Why do people reject the science? Because they think that it's incompatible with the solutions that they would endorse. There's a lot to learn here, and it's fascinating to see. I love that you got flood, floods, and flooding, kind of covering all the, maybe we should have like a 2 flood, a will flood. All right, so this brings us to the question, how can we respond? And the former president's science advisor, John Holdren, said something, I think, which was really smart a couple years ago. He said, at this point, we have 3 choices. We can reduce emissions, we can adapt, or we can what? Suffer. And he furthermore added, we are going to do some of each. We can't pick anymore. People sometimes still ask me today, should we mitigate or adapt? I'm like, yes. There is no choice anymore. We can't say we're going to do this or that. The only question we have is what the mix will be, because the more we reduce, the less adaptation is required and the less suffering there will be. So how do we move forward on something like this? The first thing to do moving forward is to look at the concerns we already have, the risks that are already on our priority list. I don't know what they are. You know that better than I do. What are the things we're already worried about? Are we worried about aging and crumbling infrastructure? Are we worried about economic inequity and social justice? Are we worried about air quality and health impacts? Are we worried about flooding? Apparently, yes, we are very worried about flooding. Then step 2 is to connect these to what causes it. Is it being caused by heat waves or drought or heavy rainfall events, or exacerbated? Not caused, but exacerbated. And for some of our risks, we simply build resilience to the risks that already exist. Are tornadoes going to go away? No. Are they changing? Possibly. How? I don't know. But they're not going away, so we can build resilience. For others, we know enough about the direction of the trend. We know that heavy rainfall is going up. We know that flood risk is increasing. We know that our vulnerability is going up, and so we can make decisions that way. And for others, and this is part of what I actually do, I'm actually going to show you some of my real research for just a second. For others, we develop customized climate projections for states and for cities, even for individual airport locations, where we answer important questions like how much is our heavy rainfall increasing? So if we're installing new storm sewer systems, how big should the pipes be? The bottom picture is actually a joke. They wouldn't put that kind of thing in Delaware. But it really makes a financial difference. If you're looking at putting in a system this big or this big or this big, you want to know how long and how much things will be changing over the history of that system, that stormwater system. We did some interesting work with Boston Logan Airport. They wanted to know when they should resurface their runways in a material that was more resilient to extreme heat. And so we looked at very specific thresholds, like days over 95 degrees, and how those would change in the future. So what does adaptation look like in the Midwest? It looks like this. Where do you start the conversation? You start the conversation by identifying the risks. More than 10 years ago, I was put in a small windowless room with sack lunches and representatives from 18 city departments in Chicago. We were basically told not to leave the room until we had figured out how to talk about how climate change affects Chicago, and I had never done this before. And clearly they hadn't either. We were all wondering what we were doing there. So we started talking about how, we could look at days per year over 90 degrees, and then the CTA said, oh, could you do 92 degrees? I said, yeah, we could. Why? Well, because our rails warp over 92 degrees. We have to run cooling trains, and we even have to shut down the metro line sometimes. It's really expensive. We want to know by when, and we can't do this year by year, but we can do this decade by decade, by when we will have a certain number of days per year over this temperature threshold, because we can proactively replace our rails ahead of that. We said, yeah, we can do that. And then the Department of Emergency Response, who had been the ones at the back of the room clearly wondering why they were in the room, they said, oh, well, could you do 94? And I said, yeah, we could do 94 days per year over 94 degrees. Why? And they said, well, because we staff by the thermometer. In South Chicago, the emergency calls, go way up the hotter it gets. And then they said, well, could you look at the number of times temperature crosses the freeze-thaw barrier? I said, oh, I know why you're asking that one. Potholes. Elections are sometimes won or lost on potholes. And we've all had that experience driving up 94, right? So yes, we looked at that. We looked at number of days per year over 2.3 inches of rain, because that's associated with combined sewer overflow, which is a huge problem for Chicago. We looked at lake levels in Lake Michigan, because what if the lake levels dropped too far and the Chicago River started flowing back into Lake Michigan? It would violate the International Joint Commission on the Great Lakes and lead to an incident with Canada, and you do not want that. You would have more Tim Hortons than you knew what to do with. Oh, wouldn't that be terrible? And free health care. So Chicago reacted. As I mentioned before, they built new reservoirs. They reduced their urban heat island effect through green roofs and through planting. They actually looked at the costs, the financial costs of adapting to a higher and a lower future. But where did the conversation start? It didn't start with the climate scientists. It started with the people who knew what was going on, and then connecting the dots. So we talked about adaptation. What does mitigation look like? I want to give you 2 examples of hope for mitigation in some of what you might consider the least hopeful places in the world. Whenever you talk about mitigation, reducing carbon emissions, people say, but what about? And 9 times out of 10, the what about is followed by either Texas or China. Sometimes Alberta. I'll kind of put it into the Texas category. Let me just give you a couple of stories of hope from Texas. Here we go. Texas has the biggest military base in the US called Fort Hood, and Fort Hood bought a new contract for wind and solar last January because they would save taxpayers over $160 million. Because wind and solar is cheaper than natural gas in Texas. Our wind energy is going up year by year by year in Texas. We have entire towns going green. This is Georgetown. They went green because, with renewable energy, because 3 business students from the local college crunched the numbers and convinced them they'd save money. That's great. We know in China they have terrible air quality, but we also know that they're doing amazing things, like putting in panda-shaped solar farms, or flooding old abandoned coal mines and putting floating solar panels over top of them, or putting in offshore wind. And they're investing hundreds of billions of dollars. We know that there's really cool technology going in all around the world, whether it's the Tesla solar roofs, or whether it's pay-as-you-go solar in sub-Saharan Africa, where 700 million people live without electricity. These changes are revolutionizing our world. Plug-in cars, funky new light bulbs, and then, just all the old stuff, like eating lower down the food chain and turning down the lights and off the water when you don't need it. We're seeing these changes everywhere. But I want to remind you, though, that there aren't just 2 choices, there's 3 choices. And when we look globally at who is most impacted by a changing climate, it's the very people who have contributed least to the problem. This is true on a global scale, but it is also true right here in the US. Those who are poor, those who are vulnerable, those who are already challenged by poverty, by hunger, by inequality, by injustice, those are the people who are most affected by a changing climate, no matter where we live. Whether we live on an ocean front affected by rising sea levels, whether we live up in the Arctic where our homes are built on ground that used to be permanently frozen and is now crumbling, whether we live in the global south where 1/3 of the entire country of Bangladesh was underwater last September due to unprecedented monsoon floods, whether we live in Syria, where the drought that drove over 1 million farmers into the city and led to a over 50% unemployment rate was 3 times more likely as a result of a changing climate. We care about climate change not only because we need to adapt to these changes, but because if we do not adapt to these changes, we will suffer. Why do we care? We care because, this is the image that I have when I think about a changing climate, we care about it because we're already putting all of our effort and our money and our time and our hopes and our prayers and everything we have into a bucket to try to fix what? To try to fix inequality, injustice, poverty, lack of education, lack of access to resources, hunger, disease, things that nobody should be dying from in 2018. We're already pouring all of our efforts into this bucket, but the bucket has a hole in the bottom, and the hole is climate change. And the hole is getting bigger and bigger, and again, that is why we care. It's not because climate change is a separate bucket over here that we should be diverting some of our water into. It's because it's the hole in the bucket that we're already doing everything we can to fix. That is why we care. So let me ask you now. What to you, and you can answer in full sentences here because it's going to scroll, so full sentence or phrase, I'm not going to be a grammar police here. What to you is the biggest benefit of acting? What is the biggest benefit, co-benefit of acting? Because one of the most frequent arguments I get is, we're just one blank. I'm just one person. We're just one city. We're just one state. We're just one country. We're just one blank. We can't fix climate all by ourselves. And my point to them is there is every reason in the world to take these actions because they will benefit us. And you all know more than I do why they would. So what are the benefits? Hopefully you can read them here. I know you guys can't read them. There's all kinds of other benefits to acting. And sometimes, and I know this is difficult, but if I'm a scientist and I can do this, then you can do this too. Sometimes we can agree to disagree. I have agreed to disagree on the science with people. Doesn't mean that I think they have a valid point. I don't. but I am willing to let it go. I'm willing to say, okay, you think climate change is a global hoax perpetuated by thousands of scientists over 200 years. Okay. But we're on the same page when it comes to the importance of solar energy growing local jobs. That's okay. We can work together. You think that it's natural cycles or sunspots. But that's okay because you agree that it's really important to look at conservation and air quality and working with our kids in their schools. That's okay. So this is the idea that I want to leave you with. We're all trying to fill the buckets of things that we need to fill to help people in this world. But as we fill those buckets, you might have seen this cartoon before, as we fill those buckets, we can do that by connecting the dots between the priorities people already have and the solutions that have all kinds of other benefits. Independence. What is more American than independence? There's a Green Tea Party for that very reason. Preserving local ecosystems. Sustainability, green jobs, livable cities, renewables, clean water, air, healthy children. We really can change the world, and we can do that not by changing people. Nope, we don't have to change people. All we have to do is help people understand how caring about a changing climate is exactly who they already are. Thank you.